The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man, and he had a steward who was denounced to him for being wasteful with his property. He called for the man and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Draw me up an account of your stewardship, because you are not to be my steward any longer.' Then the steward said to himself, 'Now that my master is taking the stewardship away from me, what am I to do? Dig? I am not strong enough. Go begging? I should be too ashamed. I know what I will do to make sure that when I am dismissed from office, there will be some to welcome me into their homes.' Then he called his master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' 100 measures of oil,' was the reply. The steward said, 'Here, take your bond, sit down straight away and write 50. To another he said, 'And you, sir, how much do you owe?' 100 measures of wheat,' was the reply. The steward said, 'Here, take your bond and write 80. The master praised the dishonest steward for his astuteness. For the children of this world are more astute in dealing with their own than are the children of light. And so I tell you this, use money, tainted as it is, to win you friends, and thus make sure that when it fails you, they will welcome you into the tents of eternity. The man who can be trusted in little things can be trusted in great. The man who is dishonest in little things will be dishonest in great. If then you cannot be trusted with money, that tainted thing, who will trust you with genuine riches? And if you cannot be trusted with what is not yours, who will give you what is your very own? No servant can be the slave of two masters. He will either hate the first and love the second, or treat the first with respect and the second with scorn. You cannot be the slave both of God and of money." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Had an interesting set of readings for this Mass today, starting off with Amos. He was one of the minor prophets, as they're called. There were 12 prophets who wrote quite short works, and they're grouped together and known as the minor prophets, or the 12 prophets. They're minor, not because they're not so important as the big ones like Jeremiah and Isaiah and so on, but they're minor just because of the brevity of the books. Well, Amos is probably one of the first of those prophets to live, and he lived in the middle of the 8th century BC. And that was a time of growing wealth in Israel. And I suppose inevitably, we might say, that led to problems, which were particularly the abuse of wealth, people seeking themselves, and most especially the oppression of the poor, the dishonesty, as we read in this reading, of the scales and so on, trying to get their religious feasts over with, the Sabbaths and the full moons, so that they can get on and trade and make more money for themselves. But Amos was warning them. He started off life as a shepherd. He didn't have any connections with the prophetic or really religious life, as we might call it nowadays. But God called him. He left the desert where he had his sheep and then preached. But he didn't last long. He was then expelled from the country and went back to shepherding. But it's an important part of the prophetic tradition in speaking out against injustice, particularly the oppression of the poor. And perhaps Jesus had that in mind, or one of the things in mind, that tradition in mind, when he spoke out oppression against the poor and attitude towards riches that we have in Luke's Gospel. One of the Luke's themes that he tries to bring out is Jesus' attitude towards the poor, and don't trust in riches and wealth, throughout his gospel. But we had chapter 16, or part of chapter 16, which deals with bringing together perhaps most of Jesus' sayings on this issue, all in one chapter. And the first bit that we heard was a bit difficult to understand, wasn't it? This rather strange parable of the landowner whose steward is denounced to him for misdealings, probably using his master's money to make money for himself or something like that. So he's going to be dismissed. And so in order to find himself another cushy job, he's rather nice, in inverted commas we might say, to his master's debtors, and sort of counsels a bit, sort of get in with them so he can find another job. And his master praises him for his astuteness. So what he's saying is, well, yes, I mean, you've got to think of yourself, haven't you? But you've been dishonest, but you've still showed forethought. And then Jesus is saying, use money to win yourselves friends in heaven. In other words, spend it well. Use it for those who really need it. Look after the poor, charitable works and so on. All those kind of things. Or just care for others rather than looking after number one. So the whole of Jesus' attitude is not that money is bad, not that the need for money is bad. It's part of life, but it's having the right attitude towards it. So in other words, we're not mastered by money, by greed, by the desire to have goods and so on, but rather mastered by God, but we do need money to live. In between those two readings, we had part of the first letter of St. Paul to Timothy. He wrote 2 letters to Timothy and 1 to Titus, and they were probably both what we call bishops now, episcopoi, overseers. And at that time, the distinction between bishop and priest wasn't terribly clear, which emerged a little bit later on in the early church. But these collection of three letters, 2 to Timothy and 1 to Titus, are called the pastoral epistles. And unlike Paul's weighty letters, which are addressing theological issues like grace, very importantly, righteousness, and whether we should be following Jewish laws and so on, here in these letters, Paul is much more sort of calm, as it were, and trying to give directions about just keeping the church going, being protected from Judaizing influences and so on, perhaps a little bit of Gnosticism that had started to creep in. They were written towards the end of Paul's career, so around about 65 AD. He'd already been in prison for a few years, but was then released, and he probably wrote these afterwards. He seemed to give some indication that he knew that he was going to die fairly soon, and in fact he did, of course, because then he was imprisoned and beheaded, and that was in 67 AD. So a couple of years before he died, he wrote these letters. So he's encouraging his new bishops to lead reverent lives, offer prayers for everybody, keep the church together and keep persevering. So then if we turn ourselves back to the gospel, we might ask ourselves today then, what is our attitude to wealth? Where does it stand in our priorities? Is it number one, or does God come first and direct our lives? And then, of course, we need to have money, but how do we use that? Is that within the sight of God, or is it just to make ourselves look better than everybody else, or whatever it might be, to bring us the pleasures that we want? It's an important issue that we all need to think about, is the place of money in our lives. And does it take the place of God, or does God number one in our lives?